Greetings, my name is Masenya, and for assignment number 2, my presentation will be on topic 2, post-colonial and decolonial theory, and theme 1, colonizing knowledges. So we can start by defining what is coloniality, and it has so many definitions, and one of the definitions is that coloniality refers to the organization and systematic distribution of power through the control of access to knowledge, moral, and artistic resources by the dominant group. And when you look into the SA history online, it says that the main reasons why Europeans began to search for the sea routes to the east was to avoid paying expensive custom duties or taxes. The rulers of every country between India and Europe charged a tax on spice shipment as goods passed through their land. Europeans used spices such as salt, nutmeg, and cloves to preserve their meat, as they did not have refrigerators at that time to keep their meat fresh. During the 15th century, the Portuguese began to explore the west coast of Africa. They established trading stations and began trading in gold and slaves in competition with the inland trans-Saharan trade routes. Diogo Cao reached the mouth of Congo River in 1483 and Cape Cross in 1486. And Diaz was the first European to sail around southern tip of Africa. He reached Mossel Bay in 1448. On his way back to Portugal, he saw Cape Peninsula for the first time and named it Cape of Storms because of the bad weather the ship experienced there. So in essence, the Europeans now they found a route that they can use and not pay the taxes in the Middle East. As they see these new places, they began to have stops in these places and they started to colonize the places. All these stops were different African countries. So the colonial empires became rich and powerful as the empires grew in size. However, the colonies were expensive to run, especially if there were wars involved. And Europe, in particular Britain, was able to industrialize because of raw materials obtained from colonies and because colonies provided market for manufactured goods. Colonialism did not cause racism, but it helped to reinforce the belief that Europeans were a dominant race and therefore superior, and that other races were subordinate and therefore inferior. One way in which coloniality dominated through it was the relegation of local languages to be the secondary mode of communication, and that point was argued well by Mpofu when he stated that is an African Renaissance possible when we, the keepers of memory, have to work outside of our own linguistic memory and within the present house of European linguistic memory, often drawing from our own experiences and art history to enrich the already rich European history. One of the most influential theorists was Karl Marx, and his view on colonialism. He says that colonialism is a form of capitalism imposing exploitation and social variation. Marx believed that working within the capitalist world system, the uneven development of colonialism is closely related. A file, corruption and large-scale development and system-dependent economies distortions, psychological and social chaos, poverty, and great dependence on neo-colonialism, according to Marxist historian, whether it is in the Western European countries' colony, stealing more than half of a normal life, the lack of nutrition citizens in the colonies, and the production means raw materials and looking for investment opportunities is the result of the accumulation of capital, competition between capitalism, Lenin imperialism, colonialism, imperialist monopoly capitalism through colonialism, and Knight Sonja S. explained that Vladimir Lenin called a firm principle of self-determination of the people in his socialist revolution thesis on the right of self-determination of Socialist International Plan OLL a key factor. He quoted Lenin that the right of people's self-determination, special rights in the political sense of independence, freedom, political separation of the rights of the oppressed countries, more specifically, the demand for political reasons. Democracy suggests complete freedom to stir for cessation and for a survey on cessation by the seceding nation state. And now we'll go into the artist that had artworks against coloniality. The first artist that we'll look at is Yinka Shonibare with his Scramble for Africa. Yinka was born in London and raised in Nigeria, and he moved back to England where he went to art school. In a lot of his works, you'll see people dressed in this batik fabrics. These are patterns that people have often considered as generally African. And why do we think that? Because history of colonialism is insidious and often give us some bad intelligence about our own lives. Shonibare is pointing to the actual history of the fabric, which is not only African at all. It was inspired by design in the Dutch Indonesia, produced in England, and then sold back to West African colonized lands. By the 1960s, it became not only known as an African fabric, but it was actually considered a symbol of African independence and culture by Africans. By inserting it into his sculptures, Shonibare uses his art to wake us up from some of the things we don't know about colonialism and challenge some of the things we think we do. The second artist that we look at is Kent Monkman with his artwork called The Scoop. Canada, where Kent comes from, is known for its history of colonialism. And then Monkman a crew of Canadian painter has taken on his history using the language we might be familiar with. A massive painting that usually features political, biblical, or historical events. Maybe the ones that mostly they will depict the French Revolution or a raft at a lost sea. Mogman turns this genre on its head in the most disturbing ways in The Scoop, his painting from 2008. The colors and the arrangement of the figures mimic a huge painting we are used to seeing, but what's actually happening on the canvas is something more terrible: the kidnapping of indigenous children from their parents and their homes to be taken to residential schools where they are cut off from their language, culture, and families. By making this artwork, Kent uses a form of painting that's usually state sanctioned and that usually celebrates colonial triumph to expose the evil reality of colonialism. This particular artwork of Kent, it can be linked to the slavery and the Jim Crow era in the United States, where African Americans were brutalized, mistreated in almost every imaginable way. African American babies were being used as alligator baits and they will literally go and snatch African American babies to use them to lure alligators out of the water. So they used real babies to catch the alligators. So Kent's work, it has that connection with these African American babies that were used as the alligator baits. The fourth artist that we look at is Esther Utjiua Muinjangue with the OvaHerero and Nama activist protest in Berlin. Esther, who is the chairwoman for OvaHerero Genocide Foundation, was at the core of calling for reparation from the German state for injustice that the former colonial power did to the Herero and the Nama in the colony of known as the German South Africa. Between 1904 and 1908, Herero and Nama uprising were brutally suppressed and more than 90,000 were killed. The slaughter is seen as the first genocide in the history of the 20th century. The last artist that we'll look at is Kara Walker with her performance called Unreliable Narrator. From the top down, the huge fountains tells a story of Black Atlantic, the fusion of Black cultures with other cultures from around the world, while alluding to Victoria Memorial, which stands outside Buckingham Palace. Like Hugh Locke, Walker is critical of British Empire. In a subversion of the statue of Victoria, Empress of India, which is topped with a figure of winged victory, Walker uses her monument to foreground the harsh experiences of Black people from Africa and its diaspora, questioning how we choose to memorialize our histories. The brutality of this history has ignited the debate over whether it is useful or appropriate for histories of violence against black people to be the subjects of artworks. In closing, we'll look at the post-colonialism, the basics of post-colonialism, which it is to examine how societies, governments, and people in the formerly colonized regions of the world experience international relations. The use of post by post-colonial scholars by no means suggests that the effects or impacts of colonial rule are now long gone. Rather, it highlights the impact that colonial and imperial histories still have in shaping a colony way of thinking about the world and how Western forms of knowledge and power marginalize the non-Western world. Post-colonialism is not only interested in understanding the world as it is, but also as it ought to be. It is concerned with disparities in global power and wealth accumulation, and why some states and groups exercise so much power over others. Post-colonial theory has influenced the way we read text, the way we understand national and transnational histories, and the way we understand the political implication of our own knowledge. Thank you.